Hi, it's Miss Though. You ready for chapter 2 of Number the Stars? I am. Did you talk with your families about World War II and about the Nazis? About what they know? I'll bet they have some interesting stories. I'll bet they do. So this is Number the Stars by Lois Lowry. I'm Miss Though, and let's read chapter 2. I forgot to put a bookmark in. I'll try to remember that today. Chapter 2. Who is the man who rides past? Tell me a story, Anne-Marie, begged Kirsty as she snuggled beside her sister in the big bed they shared. Tell me a fairy tale. Anne-Marie smiled and wrapped her arms around her little sister in the dark. All Danish girls grew up with familiar fairy tales. Hans Christian Andersen, the most famous of the tale-tellers, had been Danish himself. Do you want the one about the little mermaid? That one had always been Anne-Marie's own favorite, but Kirsty said no. Tell the one that starts with a king and a queen, and they have a beautiful daughter. All right. Once upon a time there was a king, Anne-Marie began. And a queen, whispered Kirsty. Don't forget the queen. And a queen. They lived together in a wonderful palace, and... Was the palace named Amalienborg? Kirsty asked sleepily. Shh, don't keep interrupting, or I'll never finish the story. No, it wasn't Amalienborg. It was a pretend palace. Anne-Marie talked on, making up a story of a king and a queen and their beautiful daughter, Princess Kirsten. She sprinkled her tale with formal balls, fabulous gold-trimmed gowns, and feasts of pink frosted cupcakes, until Kirsty's deep, even breathing told her that her sister was sound asleep. She stopped, waited for a moment, half expecting Kirsty to murmur, "Then what happened?" But Kirsty was still. Anne-Marie's thoughts turned to the real king, Christian X, and the real palace, Amalienborg, where he lived in the center of Copenhagen. How the people of Denmark loved King Christian. He was not like fairy tale kings, who seemed to stand on balconies, giving orders to subjects, or who sat on golden thrones demanding to be entertained and looking for suitable husbands for their daughters. King Christian was a real human being, a man with a serious, kind face. She had seen him often when she was younger. Each morning he had come from the palace on his horse Jubilee and ridden alone through the streets of Copenhagen, greeting his people. Sometimes, when Anne-Marie was a little girl, her older sister, Lisa, had taken her to stand on the sidewalk so that she could wave to King Christian. Sometimes he had waved back to the two of them and smiled. Now you are special forever, Lisa had told her once, because you have been greeted by a king. Anne-Marie turned her head on the pillow and stared through the partly opened curtains of the window into the dim September night. Thinking of Lisa, her solemn, lovely sister, always made her sad. So she turned her thoughts again to the king, who was still alive, as Lisa was not. She remembered a story that Papa had told her. Shortly after the war began, shortly after Denmark had surrendered and the soldiers had moved in overnight to take their places on the corners. One evening, Papa had told her that earlier he was on an errand near his office, standing on the corner waiting to cross the street when King Christian came by on his morning ride. One of the German soldiers had turned suddenly and asked a question of a teenage boy nearby. "Who is that man that rides past here every morning on his horse?" the German soldier had asked. Papa said he had smiled to himself, amused that the German soldier did not know. He listened while the boy answered. "He is our king," the boy told the soldier. "He is the king of Denmark." "Where is his bodyguard?" the soldier had asked. "And do you know what the boy said?" Papa had asked Anne-Marie. She was sitting on his lap. She was little then, only 7 years old. She shook her head, waiting to hear the answer. The boy looked right at the soldier and he said, "All of Denmark is his bodyguard." Anne-Marie had shivered. It sounded like a very brave answer. "Is this true, Papa?" she asked what the boy said. Papa thought for a moment. He always considered questions very carefully before he answered them. "Yes," he said at last, "it is true. Any Danish citizen would die for King Christian to protect him." "You too, Papa?" "Yes." "And Mama?" "Mama too." Anne-Marie shivered again. "Then I would too, Papa, if I had to." They sat silently for a moment. From across the room, Mama watched them, and Anne-Marie and Papa, and she smiled. Mama had been crocheting that evening 3 years ago, the lacy edging of a pillowcase, part of Lisa's trousseau. A trousseau is what they give people when they get married a long time ago, like a whole bunch of things that were very special for their new house when they got married. Her fingers moved rapidly, turning the thin white thread into an intricate narrow border. Lisa was a grown-up girl of 18 then, about to be married to Peter Nielsen. When Lisa and Peter married, Mama said Anne-Marie and Kirsty would have a brother for the very first time. "Papa," Anne-Marie had said finally, into the silence, "sometimes I wonder why the king wasn't able to protect us. Why didn't he fight the Nazis so that they wouldn't come into Denmark with their guns?" Papa sighed. "We are such a tiny country," he said, "and they are such an enormous enemy. Our king was wise. He knew how few soldiers Denmark had. He knew that many, many Danish people would die if we fought." "In Norway they fought," Anne-Marie pointed out. Papa nodded. "They fought very fiercely in Norway. They had those huge mountains for the Norwegian soldiers to hide in. Even so, Norway was crushed." In her mind, Anne-Marie had pictured Norway as she remembered it from the map at school, up above Denmark. Norway was pink on the school map. She imagined the pink strip of Norway crushed by a fist. "Are there German soldiers in Norway now, the same as here?" "Yes," Papa said. "In Holland, too," Mama had added from across the room, "and Belgium and France." "But not in Sweden," Anne-Marie announced, proud that she knew so much about the world. Sweden was blue on the map, and she had seen Sweden, even though she had never been there. Standing behind Uncle Henrik's house north of Copenhagen, she had looked across the water, the part of the North Sea that was called the Kattegat, to the land on the other side. "That is Sweden you are seeing," Uncle Henrik had told her. "You are looking across to another country." "That's true," Papa had said. "Sweden is still free." You know, every time I read that section, it makes me think of when I'm standing in Detroit, when I'm standing on the riverfront, on the Riverwalk, and I can look across the water, and on the other side, what do we see? We see Canada. It's exactly right. Those of you who have ever been to the Riverwalk know that we can stand on the waterfront and look, and just a mile on the other side is another country. Not everybody has that experience. Lots of people who live in the United States never get to see Canada because it's so far away from where they live. But here in Detroit, we can look across just like she was able to. Anne-Marie was able to stand in her country, Copenhagen, and look across, and she was able to see Sweden, look across the water, just like we can. So we can connect to her in that way. And now, I'm going to go back to the book. And now, 3 years later, it was still true, but much else had changed. King Christian was getting old, and he had been badly injured last year in a fall from his horse, faithful old Jubilee, who had carried him around Copenhagen for so many mornings. For days they thought he would die, and all of Denmark had mourned. But he hadn't. King Christian X was still alive. It was Lisa who was not. It was her tall, beautiful sister who had died in an accident 2 weeks before her wedding. In the blue carved trunk in the corner of this bedroom, Anne-Marie could see its shape even in the dark, were folded Lisa's pillowcases with their crocheted edges, her wedding dress with its hand-embroidered neckline unworn, and the yellow dress that she had worn and danced in with its full skirt flying at the party celebrating her engagement to Peter. Mama and Papa never spoke of Lisa. They never opened the trunk, but Anne-Marie did, from time to time when she was alone in the apartment. Alone, she touched Lisa's things gently, remembering her quiet, soft-spoken sister who had looked forward to marriage and children of her own. Red-headed Peter, her sister's fiancé, had not married anyone in the years since Lisa's death. He had changed a great deal. Once, he had been like a fun-loving older brother to Anne-Marie and Kirsty, teasing and tickling, always a source of foolishness and pranks. Now he still stopped by the apartment often, and his greetings to the girls were warm and smiling, but he was usually in a hurry, talking quickly to Mama and Papa about things Anne-Marie didn't understand. He no longer sang nonsense songs that they had once made Anne-Marie and Kirsty shriek with laughter, and he never lingered anymore. Papa had changed too. He seemed much older and very tired, defeated. The whole world had changed, only the fairy tales remained the same. And they lived happily ever after, Anne-Marie recited, whispering into the dark, completing the tale for her sister who slept beside her, one thumb in her mouth. That's the end of chapter 2, but I want you to know that King Christian was a very real person. He was the king of Denmark, and he did ride through the streets to be with his people. And people think that he was a very brave king. He was a brave king because he didn't fight, and sometimes that is one of the hardest things to do at all, is to not fight when things get tricky. But Denmark is a very tiny country. Maybe after you listen to this, you can Google it and look at it on a map. It is a very tiny country. It is not big like the United States. It is not big like Germany. And it was important to the Germans because it was very close to the water. And the Germans wanted to get to the water because they used ships to get supplies in and out to their country and to their soldiers. And when this very big Nazi army from Germany came, King Christian looked at the army that wanted to fight his country, and he looked at his country, and he loved the people in his country very, very much. And he did not want any of them to die. And so he surrendered very quickly to Hitler, who was in charge of the Nazi army, because he felt if he surrendered, then his people would not die. And it was more important to him to keep people alive than for him to fight. So some people think he was very brave because he surrendered so easily and so quickly to this army. Other people think he wasn't so brave because he surrendered and they thought it would be more important to fight. But if he had fought, a lot of people would have died. So that's something to think about. When you are challenged, is it more important to step back and not take the challenge and just let things go on so that nobody gets hurt? Or is it important for you to stand up for what you believe in and maybe get hurt and maybe have other people hurt at the same time? It's a good question to think about with lots and lots of things in life. But King Christian, he made a brave choice by saying no, that he was not going to fight and risk the citizens that he loved. It's a hard choice to make. But chapter 3 looks like it's pretty short, so let's read chapter 3. Chapter 3 is called, Where is Mrs. Hirsch? The days of September passed, one after the other, much the same. Anne-Marie and Ellen walked to school together and home again, always now taking the longer way, avoiding the tall soldier and his partner. Kirsty dawdled behind them or scampered ahead, never out of their sight. The two mothers still had their coffee together in the afternoons. They began to knit mittens as the days grew slightly shorter and the first leaves began to fall from the trees, because another winter was coming. Everyone remembered the last one. There was no fuel for the homes and apartments in Copenhagen, and the winter nights were terribly cold. Like the other families in their building, the Johansons had opened the old chimney and installed a little stove to use for heat when they could find coal to burn. Mama used it sometimes for cooking, because electricity was rationed now. At night, they used candles for light. Sometimes Ellen's father, a teacher, complained in frustration because he couldn't see in the dim light to correct his students' papers. "Soon we will have to add another blanket to your bed," Mama said one morning as she and Anne-Marie tidied the bedroom. "Kirsty and I are lucky to have each other for warmth in the winter," Anne-Marie said. "Poor Ellen, to have no sisters." "She will have to snuggle in with her Mama and Papa when it gets cold," Mama said, smiling. "I remember when Kirsty slept between you and Papa. She was supposed to stay in her crib, but in the middle of the night she would climb out and get in with you," Anne-Marie said, smoothing the pillows on the bed. Then she hesitated and glanced at her mother, fearful that she had said the wrong thing, the thing that would bring the pained look to her mother's face. The days when Kirsty slept in Mama and Papa's room were the days when Lisa and Anne-Marie shared this bed. But Mama was laughing quietly. "I remember, too," she said. "Sometimes she wet the bed in the middle of the night." "I did not," said Kirsty haughtily from the bedroom doorway. "I never, ever did that." Mama, still laughing, knelt and kissed Kirsty on the cheek. "Time to leave for school, girls," she said. She began to button Kirsty's jacket. "Oh, dear," she said suddenly. "Look, this button has broken right in half. Anne-Marie, take Kirsty with you after school to the little shop where Mrs. Hirsch sells thread and buttons. See if you can buy just one to match the others on her jacket. I'll give you some kroner. It shouldn't cost very much." Kroner is the type of coin. It's the money that they use in Denmark. But after school, when the girls stopped at the shop, which had been there as long as Anne-Marie could remember, they found it closed. There was a new padlock on the door and a sign, but the sign was in German. They couldn't read the words. "I wonder if Mrs. Hirsch is sick," Anne-Marie said as they walked away. "I saw her Saturday," Ellen said. "She was with her husband and their son. They all looked just fine, or at least the parents looked just fine. The son always looks like a horror," she giggled. Anne-Marie made a face. The Hirsch family lived in the neighborhood, so they had seen the boy Samuel often. He was a tall teenager with thick glasses, stooped shoulders, and unruly hair. He rode a bicycle to school, leaning forward and squinting, wrinkling his nose to nudge his glasses into place. His bicycle had wooden wheels now that rubber tires weren't available, and it creaked and clattered on the street. "I think the Hirsches all went on vacation to the seashore," Kirsty announced. "And I suppose they took a big basket of pink frosted cupcakes with them," Anne-Marie said sarcastically to her sister. "Yes, I suppose they did," Kirsty replied. Anne-Marie and Ellen exchanged looks that meant, "Kirsty is so dumb." No one in Copenhagen had taken a vacation at the seashore since the war began. There were no pink frosted cupcakes. There hadn't been for months. Still, Anne-Marie thought, looking back at the shop before they turned the corner, where was Mrs. Hirsch? The Hirsch's family had gone somewhere. Why else would they close the shop? Mama was troubled when she heard the news. "Are you sure?" she asked several times. "We can find another button someplace," Anne-Marie reassured her, "or we can take one from the bottom of the jacket and move it up. It won't show very much." But it didn't seem to be the jacket that worried Mama. "Are you sure the sign was in German?" she asked. "Maybe you didn't look carefully." "Mama, it had a swastika on it." Her mother turned away with a distracted look. "Anne-Marie, watch your sister for a few moments and begin to peel the potatoes for dinner. I'll be right back." "Where are you going?" Anne-Marie asked as her mother started for the door. "I want to talk to Mrs. Rosen." Puzzled, Anne-Marie watched her mother leave the apartment. She went to the kitchen and opened the door to the cupboard where the potatoes were kept. Every night now, it seemed, they had potatoes for dinner, and very little else. Anne-Marie was almost asleep when there was a light knock on the bedroom door. Candlelight appeared as the door opened. Her mother stepped in. "Are you asleep, Anne-Marie?" "No." "Why? Is something wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, but I'd like you to get up and come out into the living room. Peter's there. Papa and I want to talk to you." Anne-Marie jumped out of bed and Kirsty grunted in her sleep. "Peter!" She hadn't seen him in a long time. There was something frightening about his being here at night. Copenhagen had a curfew, and no citizens were allowed out after 8 o'clock. It was very dangerous, she knew, for Peter to visit at this time. But she was delighted that he was here. Though his visits were always hurried, they almost seemed secret somehow, in a way she couldn't quite put her finger on. Still, it was a treat to see Peter. It brought back memories of happier times. And her parents loved Peter too. They said he was like a son. Barefoot, she ran into the living room and into Peter's arms. He grinned, kissed her cheek, and ruffled her long hair. "You've grown taller since I've seen you last," he told her. "You're all legs." Anne-Marie laughed. "I won the girls' foot race last Friday at school," she told him proudly. "Where have you been? We've missed you." "My work takes me all over," Peter explained. "Look, I brought you something. One for Kirsty, too." He reached into his pocket and handed her 2 seashells. Anne-Marie put the smaller one on the table to save it for her sister. She held the other in her hands, turning it in the light, looking at the ridged, pearly surface. It was so like Peter to bring just the right gift. "For your mama and papa, I brought something more practical. 2 bottles of beer." Mama and Papa smiled and raised their glasses. Papa took a sip and wiped the foam from his upper lip. Then his face became more serious. "Anne-Marie," he said, "Peter tells us that the Germans have issued orders closing many stores run by Jews." "Jews?" Anne-Marie repeated. "Is Mrs. Hirsch Jewish? Is that why the button shop is closed? Why have they done that?" Peter leaned forward. "It is their way of tormenting. For some reason, they want to torment Jewish people. It has happened in the other countries. They have taken their time here, have let us relax a little, but now it seems to be starting." "But why this button shop? What harm is a button shop? Mrs. Hirsch is such a nice lady. Even Samuel, he's a dope, but he would never harm anyone. How could he? He can't even see with his thick glasses." Then Anne-Marie thought of something else. If they can't sell their buttons, how will they earn a living? "Friends will take care of them," Mama said gently. "That is what friends do." Anne-Marie nodded. Mama was right, of course. Friends and neighbors would go to the home of the Hirsch family, would take them fish and potatoes and bread and herbs for making tea. Maybe Peter would even take them a beer. They would be comfortable until their shop was allowed to open up again. Then suddenly she sat upright, her eyes wide. "Mama!" she said. "Papa, the Rosens are Jewish too." Her parents nodded, their faces serious and drawn. "I talked to Sophie Rosen this afternoon after you told me about the button shop," Mama said. "She knows what is happening, but she doesn't think it will affect them." Anne-Marie thought and understood. She relaxed. "Mr. Rosen doesn't have a shop. He's a teacher. They can't close a whole school." She looked at Peter with the question in her eyes. "Can they?" "I think the Rosens will be all right," he said, "but you keep an eye on your friend Ellen and stay away from the soldiers. Your mother told me about what happened on the Osterbrigade. The street where she got stopped. I don't know how to say that street name. It's in Danish. I don't speak Danish. Anyway, her mother told him about what happened when she was stopped by the soldiers. Anne-Marie shrugged. She had almost forgotten the incident. It was nothing. They were only bored and looking for someone to talk to, I think. She turned to her father. "Papa, do you remember what you heard the boy say to the soldier? That all of Denmark would be the king's bodyguard?" Her father smiled. "I have never forgotten it," he said. "Well," Anne-Marie said slowly, "now I think that all of Denmark must be bodyguard for the Jews as well." So we shall be, Papa replied. Peter stood. I must go, he said, and you, Longlegs, it is way past your bedtime now. He hugged Anne-Marie again. Later, once more in her bed, beside the warm cocoon of her sister, Anne-Marie remembered how her father had said 3 years before that he would die to protect the king, that her mother would too. And Anne-Marie, 7 years old, had announced proudly that she also would. Now she was 10, with long legs and no more silly dreams of pink frosted cupcakes. And now she and all the Danes, those are the people that live in Denmark, were to be bodyguard for Ellen and Ellen's parents and all of Denmark's Jews. Would she die to protect them? Truly? Anne-Marie was honest enough to admit there in the darkness to herself that she wasn't sure. For a moment, she felt frightened, but she pulled the blanket up higher around her neck and relaxed. It was all imaginary anyway, not real. It was only in the fairy tales that people were called upon to be so brave, to die for one another. Not in real life Denmark. Oh, there were the soldiers, that was true, and the courageous resistance leaders who sometimes lost their lives, that was true too. But ordinary people like the Rosens and the Johansons? Anne-Marie admitted to herself, snuggling there in the quiet dark, that she was glad to be an ordinary person who would never be called upon for courage. That's the end of chapter 3. So two chapters today. Number the Stars by Lois Lowry. I'm Miss Though. Thanks for reading with me.